Hello, and thank you, Belief Narrative Network, with special thanks to Miriam and Ava Thordis for their guidance in arranging for me to speak to you today about half-human monsters of the Kentucky mountains. I am Carl Lindahl of the University of Houston, and this still photo is all you will see of me because I've been having some microphone difficulties and I've written nearly every word I intend to speak so that the text will be in plain view on a full screen PowerPoint in case you have trouble hearing my voice. And after all, the sorts of stories I will be sharing today often involve an invisible narrator because they are told in the dark. The general question which I'm raising today with a very specific case study is how does a community create and deploy monsters to depict its relationship to its environment? I'm going to deal with one place, Eastern Kentucky, in two separated time frames, 1769 to 1820, when the first Europeans arrived in this area, focusing on how they created a monsterscape. And then second, beginning 180 years later in 1949 and continuing for a couple decades, how the descendants of that population created, sustained, and deployed a seasoned monsterscape almost up to the present day. I will be focusing on this area. You see present-day Kentucky on the map. The southeastern border is formed by nearly impassable peaks and ridges of the Appalachian Mountains, which created a western wall against the English colonies, preventing them from penetrating into the west. On the bottom of the screen there, you see the 5 different ranges, sub-regions which form the Appalachian mountain chain, and it is the yellow region there in which Eastern Kentucky is found and where nearly all the narratives that we speak about today have first been told. So we're focusing on this area, part of a 1,000-mile-long mountain wall. And in this entire area, there were only 5 places that allowed wagon safe passage. So again, we're looking at the area in yellow there where the southeast extreme of Kentucky meets the western extreme of Virginia and the northern extreme of Tennessee. Daniel Boone was interested in hunting in this region and maybe taking his family to settle in the land below, beyond rather, but he had to thread the needle. In 1769, he was guided to a break in the mountain wall, now known as the Cumberland Gap, which you see in red on the map on the bottom between those giant mountain ranges, which are outlined in brown on that map. And it was through there that the first explorers penetrated. No one was interested in settling this land. This is exactly how it looked to Daniel Boone when he first showed up. He was, of course, interested in the land and especially the hunting on the other side of the mountains. His party traveled north from the Cumberland Gap, which you see at the bottom of Kentucky in the map on the left, tracing a line which eventually became known as the Wilderness Road up to Boonesboro, where 5 years later Boone was to establish a settlement. But right now there was no settlement. They were traveling through this land out of the really high mountains into an area of rolling hills and alternating forest and grassland. And it was there that he heard the earliest surviving monster account from Kentucky. Early in 1770, after being there for a few months, or trying to get there for a few months, Boone and 5 companions were the only Europeans known to be in this region around present-day Boonesboro. They are on what was called a long hunt, spending months in the wilderness, trying to get to a place and then exploit that place to kill all the game they could and take their skins and bring their skins back and sell them on the other side of the mountain. The surrounding landscape was notably unpopulated. There was a vast Shawnee Native American culture that lived to the north of the Ohio River, which forms the northern boundary of Kentucky, which you see toward the top of the map. You can look at where the state of Ohio is. And then to the south of the present day Kentucky, you had the Cherokee culture. These were both enormous cultures, and they used this area extensively for hunting. They didn't settle there because it was too important for them to hunt. It meant their livelihoods, and they were unhappy to see the colonists because they were certain that the newcomers would threaten their hunting and their homes. The encounters with Indians were relatively rare, but almost always troubled. So Boone's monster story was actually recorded in 1796, more than a quarter century after this moment, in a legal deposition that Boone gave to settle a boundary dispute. And here I quote from that deposition with the original spelling retained. In the year 1770, I encamped on Red River with 5 other men, and we had with us for our amusement the history of Samuel Gulliver's travels, wherein he gave an account of Glumdalclitch, a giant carrying him on a market day for a show to a town called Lulbegrud. Say what? What book do you carry into a wilderness where no book has been before? Would it be a book to remind you of home or to make the strange familiar? On his first journey to a wilderness untraveled by Europeans, Boone brought with him a book to make the American frontier familiarly strange. Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels was one of the best-selling books in English in the 18th century, written and published 8 years before Boone was born. It narrates 4 voyages from England to the distant pockets of the earth by one Lemuel Gulliver. Boone's testimony refers to the second journey, in which Gulliver visits a peninsula off the northwest coast of North America and encounters a race of giants, the Brobdingnagians, who dress and conduct their lives much as the human beings of Swift's time, but they are more than 10 times as tall as human beings. Back to Boone's deposition. It was the custom of the group to divide itself, with some going off to hunt while others guarded the camp. There were Native Americans who could come for those skins. There were animals that could despoil those skins. They needed to guard what they had already captured. Boone was among those minding the camp when his fellow hunter, Alexander Neely, and here I quote directly from the deposition again, Alexander Neely came to camp one night and told us he had been that day to Lulbegrud and had killed 2 Brobdingnags in their capital. Neely was initiating a tall tale guessing game that transposed Swift's wild imaginary world upon their wilderness surroundings. It took the men some time to decode Neely's account. The Brobdingnags were not humanoid giants, but in fact giant animals, American bison, the largest animals within hundreds of miles, animals that could not be found in the eastern colonies where Boone and his companions lived, and their capital was a creek where they'd come to drink when Neely shot them. Following Neely's lead, the men named the creek Lulbegrud, and that was why the deposition was necessary. People were trying to establish land rights to that particular creek area. This is a foundational story in many ways. Boone's testimony records the first known book to arrive in the Kentucky wilderness, the first known game that was played there, the first known tall tale performance there, the first European name bestowed on Kentucky wildlife, and the first naming of a frontier natural feature taken from a work of European fiction. All of these elements deserve a very close look, and we don't have time for that, but let's stop for a while to consider the book. Gulliver's Travels presents itself as the creation of a European explorer visiting places that his countrymen had never seen before. Swift describes Brobdingnag as part of North America, and the map that accompanied the most 18th century editions was pirated from the work of one of England's best known map makers. People were used to seeing this on true accounts of travel, so Swift masks his fantasy as an account of real adventures in a remote but reachable and mappable place. Swift presented a monster that was larger than life within this newly discovered world. Such amplification was part of the job of the narrator of both the true and parody travel accounts of Swift's time. Neely, in Boone's camp, followed Swift's model by presenting a bison as a Brobdingnag and a creek that was the city of Lulbogrud, the center of the universe. By the way, the names that are used in Boone and the name given to the creek are not spelled the same way as Swift did. This was the closest they could come in a tradition where spelling was not a cherished art. So Gulliver's Travels is both an example and a parody of the literature of exploration commonly read by and about travelers at the time. And Neely's Game is both an example and a parody of the oral traveler narratives on which the written ones were based. Both Swift and Neely were also tapping an old and established British oral tradition centered on a boy hero and his fights with a giant. At the same time that Boone was hunting in Kentucky, colonists in the wilderness to the north and east were telling jack tales, as documented by Joseph Doddridge, who listened to them as a boy in the 1770s, quoting directly from Doddridge, who grew up in a fort in what is now Pennsylvania. Dramatic narrations, chiefly concerning Jack and the Giant, furnished our young people with amusement during our leisure hours. Jack, always the hero of the story, after encountering many difficulties and performing many great achievements, came off conqueror of the giant. Most impressive to me in all of this account is the direct transposition of the imaginary worlds of literary fiction and oral tradition onto the surrounding landscapes by Neely and the Hunter. The travelers do not merely read or retell the tall tales, they imitate the actions of the tales and they give the names of imaginary beings to the new things that they see. Like the biblical Adam, they are naming the beasts of a new world, but this new world takes on the contour of their old world fantasies. Swift's book presented a fake map of Brobdingnag, but Boone's party made this imaginary site a real spot on the map of Kentucky. The tabula rasa of the frontier was instantly filled in, invested with the traditions of the new inhabitants. The first Kentucky monsters were so traditional that they threatened to be predictably boring, but they were deployed in ways that were playfully insane. The familiar strangeness of these old world monsters was no doubt part of their attraction. Boone, as we will learn in many ways, was uncommonly fearless, but nearly all the other colonists were overwhelmed, at least at times, in this new world. A familiar monster stalking you in the woods is far less fearsome than a monster about which you know nothing. So after all, when you think of the monsters that Neely invoked and that the tradition gave these folks, the Brobdingnags treated Gulliver very kindly. And the boy Jack never failed to kill his unkind giants. They were better than what the colonists could reasonably fear and expect behind the trees in the area where they were camped. Within 30 years, the bison Brobdingnags would be hunted to extinction in Kentucky, but the name of Lulbogrud Creek, borrowed from Swift, survives to the present day. Most visitors today, first hearing Lulbogrud spoken, assume that it is an Indian name. In this foundational account, we see the beginnings of a way of presenting real and imaginary worlds in frontier narrative. This was a world created exclusively by males. No women and girls were present in the hunting parties. The descriptions of the natural and supernatural worlds generally appear in four generic forms. On the right, you see the first person true adventure in which the narrator recounts his own experiences. In this new landscape, even true adventures told without exaggeration could surprise or even stun listeners from elsewhere. So if you move to the left of this diagram, it is easy to see how for both the people in the wilderness and the people outside the wilderness, the true adventures easily flowed into tall tales or legends, both narrative genres that are told as true. Even the American were not nearly as well represented, but nevertheless, it was there as documented. Normally told as an undisguised fantasy, often takes on the properties of a tall tale or a legend when told on the Kentucky frontier. So frontier narrative is disproportionately devoted to first-person accounts of remarkable occurrences. Appalachian narrative style, from Boone forward, emphasized truth claims, the tall tale, practical joke, legend, and true adventure personal narrative are all told as true. And the dominant style of narration for all four forms is understatement. The narrator speaks calmly, slowly describing even the most fantastic events as if they were everyday events. This uniform performance style blurs the boundaries between the genres and between fact and fiction. In all genres, the leading tendency for expressing wonder or presenting a monster is to amplify and then humanize nature. Amplify and humanize, just as Neely did when he turned bison into humanoid giants out by Lobelgood Creek. Daniel Boone's narrative style fit the frontier norm. He was terse and narrated the most outrageous adventures as if they were ordinary events. He spoke continually in understatement to considerable effect. For example, asked if he was ever lost in the woods, he answered, "Can't say I was ever lost, but I was bewildered once for 3 days." That's the normal delivery. This low-key delivery made it hard for listeners to distinguish between earnest and fanciful narration, and boy, did it make it hard for historians as well. Boone went on to become famous as the embodiment of the pathfinder, the mountain man, the long hunter. But ironically, his fame rests on the destruction of the frontier, his guiding thousands of settlers through the Cumberland Gap. In the first half of the 19th century, he was painted more often than any other American figure except George Washington. Everybody wanted a picture of Daniel Boone. And the most famous of all the Boone paintings shows him, like Moses, shepherding settlers into a promised land through the Cumberland Gap. And there you see the painting by George Caleb Bingham, painted in 1851. This was the image that popular culture began to project on Boone very early on. And he became a popular figure in pop culture legendary throughout the 19th century and well into the 20th century. He was depicted as a natural force who destroys dangerous animals and kills innumerable hostile Native Americans. Given the facts that Boone was captured by Indians at least 6 times and had 3 blood relatives killed in Indian attacks, researchers are astonished to learn that he may have killed no more than 1 Native American, maybe 3 at most. And researchers wonder why no Indian ever killed him until they look closer into his story, because Boone did indeed maintain that Indians were better friends to him than his white acquaintances. And when captured by Shawnees in 1778, rather than being killed by them, because he had killed some of them in rescuing his own daughter from captivity by the Shawnee, instead he was adopted, treated like a son, and offered in marriage to a Shawnee woman. Another irony, which is implicit in what we've been talking about so far, although portrayed as a tamer of nature, Boone loved being out in the wild. To many, he loved it too much. He was sleeping with the enemy. 19th century biographers deliberately changed parts of Boone's story to make Boone look more like them, and they suppressed the parts of his friendship with Indians and this almost obsessive love of being out in the wilderness alone. And Boone told stories about monsters. He narrated stories about fighting giants and yahoos. I intended to focus this presentation on these narratives, but the current published scholarship is too spotty for me to present without endless qualification. These stories are an embarrassment to most of Boone's biographers, who do not apply the same care and precision to oral and written narrative as they do to names and dates. The popular culture treatment of Boone in the 19th century and the many fabricated histories made the 19th century development of the Kentucky monsterscape impossible for us to trace. We're tracing the popular fantasies of other people. To give one example, the story of the Brobdingnags, as I have told it, comes directly from the original deposition, which I have examined, but the story is circulated in most 19th century histories, claim that the Brobdingnags are two Shawnee warriors, and that Neely returns to camp with their scalps. The pop culture world wanted Boone to be an Indian killer so badly that they kept changing the facts. If indeed Neely had gone off and scalped those Shawnee, the Boone party probably would have been wiped out in no time, and nobody would know any of these stories. Even the future president, Theodore Roosevelt, a relatively reliable author, repeats the scalp story in his 1890 biography of Daniel Boone. A second example, there is a very suspect tradition that at age 82, Boone traveled to Limestone, Kentucky, and told a monster story to a boy during his visit. In the passage below, John MacFaragher describes the event from his book, Daniel Boone, The Life and Legend of an American Pioneer. The boy presses the old man to tell the story. "You shall have it, honey," says Boone, and proceeds to tell of killing a 10-foot hairy giant he called a Yahoo. The Yahoos were giant beasts in human shape from Boone's favorite book, Gulliver's Travels. It was a tall tale that Boone repeated during his last year, one such as he would have told in a winter camp. There are two major problems with this account, which is from the most respected Boone biography, perhaps of the century. First, there is only one letter in which the boy listener, now an old man, recounts the adventures that Faragher is talking about here. And nowhere in that letter does the term Yahoo appear. In the letter, Boone repeatedly refers to this creature as a giant. And second, yes, Yahoos are beasts in Boone's favorite book, but they are decidedly not giants. The giants were the Brobdingnags. These errors in the most acclaimed book on Boone from the past 3 decades underline the need to access the original documents, and they have been inaccessible to me during the pandemic. I'll get to them someday. But the following 4 facts and one assertion are important. First, Boone told stories about Yahoos. We have too many accounts of that to ignore. Also, he told stories about giants. Too many accounts about that to ignore. Third, though such stories are typically ignored or distorted by historians, as we have seen, some of them likely drew upon or entered narrative tradition in Kentucky. Fourth, there are many accounts of a Kentucky mountain creature called a Yeho. And fifth, then, is my working assumption. And because there is enough evidence, I suggest a continuous tradition of Yahoo, Yeho sightings and tales in the Kentucky mountains dating back to Boone's day. And this project I'm on is trying to fill in some of the blanks. There were 6 colonists in Kentucky country in 1770 when Boone's party found bison and turned them into Brobdingnags. There were more than 73,000 counted in the first US Census in 1790, 20 years later. And in 1800, a year after Boone left Kentucky forever, there were more than 220,000. The settlers went beyond the mountains, as we've seen, to the farmable rolling hills. They destroyed the wilderness that Daniel Boone loved too much, and they made him a commodity. For the first 16 months of the pandemic, I lived in the commercialized shadow of Daniel Boone on Boone Street in Berea, Kentucky, a 10-minute walk from the Boone Tavern in the center of town. Both are pictured here in December of 2020, when I spent some time thinking of what had happened to the Kentucky monsterscape that I had been reading about and researching in various ways. Oral traditions reflecting Boone's world and its monsters are rare in the area where I now am, although Daniel Boone's name is everywhere. The monsterscape retreated back to the mountains that the settlers had to pass through and wished to leave behind. And there is a huge gap in the narrative record. 180 years passed between the time Boone first heard about the Brobdingnags and the time that someone set out to audio record the folk narrative culture of the Cumberland Mountains surrounding the gap. In 1946, Leonard W. Roberts, a native of the Kentucky mountains, was teaching young boys in Berea, right, in the foundation school, where mountain children came to stay for months at a time to get an education unavailable to them back home, where schools were too far apart and hard to reach in the places where they grew up. Roberts couldn't get them interested in reading or writing until, in frustration, he started reading to them from a collection of recently published jack tales, American, from the other side of the Appalachian Mountains. The children responded immediately that their families told similar stories, only, of course, theirs were better. So Roberts then went out to find those stories. The map you see here is from Roberts' dissertation, published in 1953, some 8 years after he started looking for these stories. 7 years, I'm sorry. The Cumberland Gap is pictured at the bottom of this slide. You can see it there, and the broken line leading up from it traces the path that Boone took to find the Brobdingnags. But if you look immediately to the right and above, you will see an area of very dense mountains and then a shaded area. Let me focus and close up on that. The mountaintops are uninhabitable, but just north of them are the headwaters of many rivers and creeks. The great majority of the storytellers recorded by Roberts lived in the shaded areas of the map near the source of those creeks. Roberts recorded for 20 years in this one area, from narrators aged 8 to 90. Capturing a good sweep of traditional tales is shared in one very confined area for well over a century. My examples in text are taken from this time frame and this one place, with one notable exception. The illustrations after this slide will show you houses from the following area, but there was an exploration, a very interesting one, to find out what children thought home looked like. And the particular pictures that you'll see in the next slides outline what those homes look like. In the 1960s, a psychologist named Robert Coles worked closely with the children of poor families throughout rural America, migrant workers and sharecroppers all over the United States, but also residents of the most remote areas of the Appalachian Mountains. He regularly asked the children to draw home. What does home look like to you? Almost everyone drew a house or an apartment, a building, or a room elsewhere in the country. But throughout Appalachia, and only in Appalachia, the drawings depicted two kinds of homes: a house utterly dwarfed by surrounding nature, or a series of natural features with no house at all. Home looked distinctly different to these people living in the mountains that shared the Yeho stories. Asked to draw home, Billy Evans, Logan County, West Virginia, a place not unlike these mountains, but some distance from where Roberts was, he pictured water gushing from a ravine by the creek that ran by his house. Another view of home by the same boy presents the moon almost leaning on a hill far off from him. Marie, who lived in Kentucky, not far from the region that we're focused on, she draws small buildings that are dwarfed by the mountains upon which they rest. Marie's schoolmate, Sally, of Martin County, Kentucky, draws a mountaintop. She says, "I like to go to the field there on top of the hill and look all over. You can see far, far away. You're closer to the sun. You're near the sky. When she had trouble at home, her grandmother told you, go out here and talk to God, because if he's ever going to hear you, he's going to hear you from here. This is where you can go for comfort when you're having trouble at home. So the Leonard Roberts collection at Berea College, Kentucky contains well over 500 audio recorded American legends, tall tales, and purported true adventures, along with hundreds more in manuscript. In these, a house or a house in the woods, or the woods figure in the overwhelming majority. The most common setting for a tale in any form is a house, a lonely house in the woods. That house is most often engulfed in nature. Not too distant from the American scape we're familiar with in many other cultures, but it's remarkable how often this is the setting. Roberts specialized in recording American. Among them, by far the most popular tale types focused on the terrible things that can happen in a lonely cabin in the woods. One of them, ATU 326, The Youth Who Wanted to Know What Fear Is, concerns a boy who is challenged to spend the night in a haunted house. Here, the horror is almost always in the form of supernatural beings, and it comes from inside the house. But true to Appalachian style, some of these tales are told as true, and as legends, and others are transformed into tall tales or jokes, and often the real scary parts come from outside. Overwhelmingly, vastly more common than the stories featured, are the stories, that feature a threat generated from outside the house. Something from outside works its way into a porous house. The most common examples of this story are related to ATU 366, The Man from the Gallows. As one of the people who's talked a lot to me about the mountain stories, Sadie Stidham has told me every child in the mountains knows that story. And I believe that may be true. And here's the normal form. A family of four is working outside when one of them finds a potato-sized toe in the ground. They've gone too long without meat, so the mother cooks the giant toe, and the family eats it for dinner. That night, the owner of the toe appears to get the toe back. Unlike the haunted house tales, Big Toe is almost never told as true, but children often act out the tale's climax, making it dramatically true when they play the part of the monster seeking vengeance, and they yell at the other child who's listening, "I've got you now." Let's look at the pervasive traits of monster tales in the Roberts collection. The houses offer no protection from monsters. They may lock you in with the monsters, but they cannot lock the monsters out. The porous house allows everything that's scary outside come right inside. Second, the narrator never tells us exactly what the monster looks like. Sometimes they are shown a body part. We get a hairy toe, a ghostly hand, or a woman who hears crying outside the house and then sees a big hairy leg inside the door. I'm going to skip on here. Monsters conform to local ecology. They do not differ much from the surrounding fauna. Even in tall tales and fairy tales, there aren't dragons or griffins or lions or flying monkeys. None of that. Fourth, the most common way in which monsters differ from everyday fauna is size. These giants, these brobdernags, that is the mark of a monster. And fifth, crucially important, a monster has to have at least one human trait. The thing with the big hairy toe is not just another animal, it speaks. A bear, a panther, anything else. To become a monster must become human in one form or another. A monster by definition is half human in this part of the world. So this brings us to the signature monster story of the Cumberland Mountains, a story which I cannot find in precisely the same form anywhere else, but pervasive in the area in which Roberts collected. If you know a story like this, anywhere like this, let me know. Robert spent a lot of time teaching children in the foundation school in Berea, but eventually one of his students, Billy McDaniel, said, come up and listen to my family and my neighbors tell these stories. So Roberts and McDaniel went up into the mountains, and from Roberts, I'm sorry, from Bill McDaniel's grandmother, he heard his first Yay-Ho tale. Up there, everyone seemed to know these tales. And Roberts published his first version in his first folktale book in 1955, South from Helfersartan, Kentucky Mountain Folktales. Uh, uh, Archer Taylor read that account and informed Roberts that folklorists had been looking for this story for 3 decades because Tarzan was a big cultural commodity at that time. And because the author of the Tarzan franchise said that he was inspired by a story about in which a human being, a male, mates with a female ape. Folklorists went crazy trying to find the source, and they couldn't find it. Ultimately, only a few forms were found, only 4 other versions. In all of those, the ape was male, and the uh, um, the ape was male, and the human being was female. Um, so. We find the story way back around 1600 in Portuguese and French accounts. And I imagine that many people in the New World told a version of this story and that Boone heard it, but I have absolutely no evidence that he ever told it. Nancy McDaniel's version, I'm going to read word for word from her recording in 1949, age 75. This presents the normal form and almost all the essential details. Once about a time, there's a man laying out, and he went to a cave, and he was laying out in there, and the Yay-Ho come and throwed a deer into him. Something would come every day and throw a deer into him and leave out. One time that Yay-Ho come and got down in there with him, and not long after that, she had a kid. Then one time he took a notion to leave her, and he would go to leave, and she wouldn't let him go. She made him come back. Finally, he got out and made her think she was going with him. And they went, and he got on a ship going across the water, and he got started and rode on off and left her. And she stood there and hollered and screamed after him. And when she seen he'd got away from her and she couldn't go, why, she tore the baby in 2 and throwed 1/2 in after him. And that's all I know of it. There was some more of it, they said, but I didn't know it. That little part I've added there is something I've transcribed from the original, which, by the way, you can find following this URL. It is available to you. It takes less time to speak than I narrate it to you, and I'd use her voice, but I think it might be tough for you to follow. This is just a sliver of a story, and the most crucial details are talked around. Yet Nancy McDaniel presents almost all the essential elements of the Kentucky oikotype. First, there's a female ape-like creature named a Yay-Ho, and the narrator seems so sure that all her listeners know what a Yay-Ho is that she doesn't bother to mention anything about it. The Yay-Ho feeds the man. They mate. She bears a child. He tries to leave. She resists. Finally, he escapes, and she tears the baby in half and throws 1/2 after him. The signal difference, setting all 5 of the Kentucky versions that Leonard Roberts and I have been able to find from 4 others, is that the human is a male and the monster female here. Invariably, the human male is wandering alone in the wilderness, much like Daniel Boone. He needs shelter and food. The monster feeds and nurtures him. In all the stories told outside Kentucky, a woman, a human woman, is captured and raped by a monster, and we have this slave situation completely different from what we find in these tales. They're all historically related, but I don't have time to show you the textual evidence. The male protagonist makes all the difference. All men present the story as truth claims. They all add realistic details about the processes of hunting and cooking and eating in the woods. And like a tall tale, the male Yay-Ho stories grow gradually out of a familiar natural environment into a situation that strains and ultimately overcomes belief. One of the narrators, whose story is also online, and I urge you to listen to, is Joe Couch, who actually tells his version in first person as a tall tale. Um, the four male narrative versions develop the male-female relationship in amazing ways. In all cases, the woman initiates the relationship by very humanely providing food for the needy man. But there are three features: the hairy body, the diet of raw food, and the woman's inability to speak that mark her as non-human and provide the source for emotional and logistic conflicts as the story unfolds. Joe Couch, for example, uh, has a lost and hungry man who fears the Yeho, but she offers him raw meat. And he says, I was afraid to eat it raw and afraid not to eat it, being she give it to me. She was going to see that I didn't starve. He's mortally afraid of her, but he appreciates this very humane gesture. The three of these tellings highlight the fundamental distinction between raw nature and cooked culture. The Yeho offers food to the raw food to the man, and he offers her cooked food. In three versions, the beast likes or learns to like cooked food. In Joe Couch's version, the man teaches the monster to cook. In Bill McDaniel's, the man ends up cooking while the woman goes out and kills the animals for him. And there's only a fourth version in which the hairy woman and the lost man never reconcile. One eats the cooked, one eats the raw, all the way through the story. In all four performances, the Yeho never speaks like a human. Sometimes she utters only this sound, yeho, yeho, or a growling noise, kind of like a dog makes when he's gnawing on a bone. In their different ways, the male narrators exploit the comic potential of raw versus cooked and animal noises versus human speech. There are scenes resembling parodies of awkward adolescent courtship as the animalesque woman and the human man grow closer to each other. And eventually there's almost a romance that develops in a couple of these stories. And in this one version that does not come from Roberts, but from a man in the same region, writing it down long after he heard it as a child, he says it wasn't long until she was staying with him all the time. He started wondering if he'd rather have her with him all the time. She was company for him. He might have to stay right there the rest of his life. If she wasn't exactly a human being, she was the next thing to it. Now, at the start, he'd been afraid to lay down and go to sleep where she could get to him. But the way she acted made him think there was no use in being uneasy. So he let her come right in and sleep with him. You know, a body will get used to anything. So there is this amazing situation in many cases leading up to this relationship, which leads to a child. In all versions, the man and this manimal woman mate have one or more children. And all of the children are described specifically, except in Nancy McDaniel's short version, as displaying their dual parentage in dramatic ways. They are either half ape and half man, or half man and half yeho, or one side hairy and the other side slick, or hairy like her from the waist up, but from waist down, smooth like him. The children are breathing evidence that nature and culture cannot fully blend. Neither half fully absorbs the other. In the end, the children cannot live. It is nature's role to do the killing and reestablish the stark division between human and animal. The human makes the first move to leave the Yeho, but it is the Yeho who destroys the child and divides it up in her own special way. From Adam's account, she throwed the part that looked like him out toward the boat, and she hugged the part that looked like her up to her breast and went running till she was out of sight in the woods. The severed halves of the child mark a bloody boundary that must never be crossed again. As comic or absurd as all of these stories can be, at least at times, there's no way to laugh away the impact of the ending. Everyone I know who shares this story feels a sort of frisson at the moment that the child is torn apart. And the episode of the torn up child continues to have that legendary impact when Jakob Grimm says the legend walks and knocks at your door. The episode of the torn up child continues to knock at the door of some As comic or absurd as all of these stories